Some people carry their mistakes on their skin. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 43 minutes before a Special Forces major would arrive and destroy everything he'd built. The words hung in the corridor outside the ICU like a challenge, delivered to the cluster of residents trailing behind him in their pristine white coats, and they laughed because Dr. Caldwell had trained them to recognize cruelty as wit. He was the hospital's golden boy, the kind of surgeon whose reputation preceded him into rooms, whose consulting fees climbed while his actual surgical outcomes remained carefully curated in databases only he could access. The residents followed because proximity to that kind of power felt like borrowed authority, and they didn't yet understand that the people who made the best mentors were rarely the ones who made you feel small. Seattle General in Savannah hummed with fluorescent lights and antiseptic tang. The ICU ward ran on the exhale of machines, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, monitors beeped in overlapping arrhythmias that trained ears learned to ignore, and the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on tile provided the background score to 8 hours of concentrated suffering. Margaret Walsh moved through this landscape like a ghost, invisible in the way that only people who had been overlooked for 7 consecutive years could become. 52 years old. Long sleeves even in Savannah heat, cotton that hung loose over her forearms, where burn scars thick as rope twisted through the skin in patterns that told stories nobody asked about. Her graying hair was pulled into a bun so tight it pulled the corners of her eyes slightly upward, making her expression seem perpetually serene. She logged medications with penmanship so precise that the pharmacy director had once pulled her charts as examples of what the newer nurses should aspire to, never mentioning Margaret by name. At 5:47 in the morning, before the residents arrived and the hospital's machinery shifted into its daytime roar, Margaret opened her locker on the 3rd floor. The space was small, a photograph of a 9-year-old girl with gap teeth and Margaret's eyes, a faded unit patch from 2012 that she kept tucked behind her spare scrubs, protein bars, a hand lotion that she applied to her scarred forearms in private moments. When she reached for her stethoscope, the tarnished challenge coin fell from the upper shelf. It caught the light for a fraction of a second, old silver dulled by years of handling, and she caught it before it hit the floor. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from a different life, when her reflexes meant the difference between a man going home to his family or going home in a flag-folded box. She glanced around the empty locker bay, confirmed no one had seen, and returned the coin to the bottom of her bag beneath the protein bars and hand lotion. The coin was the only proof that Master Chief Petty Officer Walsh had existed at all. The burn scars on her forearms appeared when she reached for an A4 bag from the top shelf. They were thick, ropey tissue that made the newer patients wince when she inserted lines. Some patients actually asked for another nurse, and Margaret would nod and step away without argument. She had learned that invisibility was a kind of gift. It meant she could work without scrutiny, could move through patient rooms with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, could hold a man's hand while he died without anyone asking why she didn't cry. 7 years at Seattle General. 7 years of charting that was flawless, of medication counts that never varied by a single milligram, of patient satisfaction scores that were quietly perfect but never highlighted, never celebrated, never mentioned during the meetings where the surgeons' names were lifted up like saints. Dr. Caldwell arrived for morning rounds at 6:18. His white coat was monogrammed, not embroidered, monogrammed, which meant someone had done the work by hand in a shop that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His smile was practiced, the kind that never reached his eyes, the kind that made you feel like you were being evaluated for some criterion you couldn't see. He moved through the ICU with the bearing of a man who understood that confidence was its own kind of scalpel. The residents trailed behind him in a constellation of deference, standing when he paused, leaning forward when he spoke, their pens moving across their notebooks even when he said nothing important. He was the kind of surgeon who had cultivated an aura that made people believe his every decision was gospel. 3 of the residents had already written their residency applications naming him as the reason they wanted to stay at Seattle General. He had never actually trained any of them. At 6:41, Dr. Caldwell paused at Margaret's station. She was logging the overnight medications, her pen moving with steady precision across the paper, her face a mask of professional neutrality that had been built through 7 years of practice. He picked up her chart without asking, his fingers moving down the entries with the kind of deliberate slowness that made it clear he was performing this moment for the resident standing behind him. The air pressure changed. You could feel it, the way the space around him became charged, the way the residents leaned in slightly, sensing that something was about to happen. The fluorescent light seemed to hum louder. Some people, he said, still studying her chart, carry their mistakes on their skin. He glanced up at her, then back at the residents. A good nurse learns from experience. The exceptional ones learn from other people's experience. He set the chart back on her desk with a kind of precision that suggested he was placing it in a museum. Margaret has been here 7 years. That's a long time to work with the same outdated protocols. He pronounced her name the way someone might say a word they'd just learned, with a kind of careful enunciation that made it clear he didn't quite believe in her as a person. The residents smiled because they had been trained to smile. Margaret's jaw tightened imperceptibly. It was the only thing that moved. Not her eyes. Not her hands. Not her breath. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, 7 years of it, held in the muscles of her face like a pressure that had nowhere to go. She continued writing. The pen didn't waver. The letters remained perfectly formed. The quality of care, Dr. Caldwell continued, speaking now to the residents as if Margaret had already stopped existing, depends on staying current. Staying sharp. Not resting on the assumption that because you've done something the same way for 7 years, that means you're doing it right. He gestured toward the ICU beds as he turned away. Let's see what we have today. Bed 3 shows interesting complications. Margaret, we'll need a fresh set of labs in the next hour. Try to get them done before rounds if you can manage it. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from knowing there will be no consequences. The residents followed him, their white coats fluttering behind them like the robes of priests following a bishop. One of them glanced back at Margaret, and she saw something flicker across his face, not quite guilt, not quite discomfort, but something like the beginning of it. He was young enough that he might still have a conscience. She hoped, for his sake, that he didn't spend too many years trying to preserve it. Margaret continued logging medications. Her hands remained steady. The penmanship didn't falter. She logged the antibiotic times, the morphine doses, the insulin adjustments with the kind of meticulous attention that had kept patients alive for decades. She had been a Master Chief Petty Officer. She had held a man's heart in her hands while mortars fell around her. She had made impossible decisions in impossible moments. 7 years ago, she had chosen to disappear, to become invisible, to trade her entire identity for a new social security number and a nursing license in a small hospital in a city where no one asked questions about your past. She had a daughter who was 9 years old and who thought her mother was just tired from long shifts. She had a challenge coin at the bottom of her bag that was worth approximately nothing and everything. The overhead intercom crackled at 6:54. Not with routine announcements, but with the specific urgency that changed the temperature of every room it reached. Trauma alert. Incoming GSW Thoracic, Special Forces Major, Helicopter ETA for minutes. The voice was steady, professional, the kind of announcement that had become routine in a hospital this size, but the words themselves carried a weight that made everyone's head turn. GSW meant gunshot wound. Thoracic meant chest. Special Forces meant the patient mattered in ways that didn't have to be explained. Margaret was moving before the announcement finished. Not running, she had been trained out of running years ago, but moving with the kind of purposeful stride that came from muscle memory recognizing a code it understood. Her hands were already pulling on fresh gloves. Her mind was already running through the list: chest tube setup, defibrillator pads, the emergency thoracotomy tray that sat in the trauma bay like a promise. She had been a Master Chief Petty Officer. She had worked in a forward operating base in Bagram where the difference between life and death was measured in seconds. That was 7 years ago. That was a different woman. That was Margaret Walsh before she had burned like a phoenix and chosen to stay ash. But her hands knew what to do. Her body understood the language of crisis. She moved toward the trauma bay, and for the first time in 7 years, the invisible nurse was moving like someone who had something to offer. The Grand Rounds conference room at Seattle General smelled like antiseptic and coffee gone cold in styrofoam cups. Margaret sat in the back row, her hands folded on the table in front of her, while Dr. Caldwell stood at the projector screen with the casual confidence of a man who had never been told no. The screen flickered. Her charting appeared, magnified, exposed. 7 years of documentation scrolled past, meticulous, thorough, the kind of notes that meant she had been there, had watched, had caught things before they became catastrophes. This, Caldwell said, his voice carrying the texture of polished granite, is what happens when we let nostalgia trump evidence-based practice. Nurse Walsh here uses a 4-point documentation system that went out with bloodletting. He tapped the screen with his laser pointer, and the red dot danced across her own handwriting like an accusation. Redundant. Obsolete. Charting should be efficient, not exhaustive. The residents laughed. Not all of them. Some. But the ones who did laugh the way people laugh when they're testing whether it's safe to follow the alpha's lead. It was. The room made that clear. Margaret's jaw tightened imperceptibly, a contraction so small only someone trained to read faces would notice. Her pen remained steady in her hand, pressing into the margin of the notepad in front of her. The pressure increased. 1 millimeter. 2. Not trembling. Never trembling. The mark on the paper deepened, dark and deliberate, a physical record of something that lived only in muscle memory and breath control. A resident in the third row, young, maybe 2 years into his training, leaned sideways toward his colleague. Isn't she the burn case? The one who's been here forever. His voice was designed to carry. Caldwell's eyes flicked toward Margaret, found her face, and saw nothing but professional neutrality. He didn't correct the resident. The silence that followed was its own kind of message. Caldwell clicked to the next slide, Margaret's patient outcomes. Safety records. Complication rates. All of it unremarkable in the way that excellence disguises itself, not extraordinary enough to provoke jealousy, just reliable enough to make you wonder why someone had been pushing to tear it down for 3 months. When we trust nursing to override surgical judgment, Caldwell continued, his tone shifting to something more paternal, more concerned, we erode the very hierarchy that keeps patients safe. Doctrine exists for a reason. The presentation lasted 17 more minutes. Margaret's charting appeared 14 more times. Each time, Caldwell found a phrase to isolate, a procedure to question, a choice to reframe as deviation rather than adaptation. By the end, if someone had been listening only to the commentary and not watching the numbers on the slides, they would have believed they had just witnessed evidence of dangerous incompetence. The room dispersed. Residents filed out, already moving on to the next case, the next lecture, the next crisis. Margaret remained in her chair for exactly 4 seconds after the last person left, her eyes fixed on the blank projection screen. Then she stood, squared her shoulders in a way that involved no visible motion, and walked out. 2 hours later, she stood at the vending machine outside the cafeteria. Her water bottle was empty, the kind of tactical oversight that happened when your brain was processing other information. She inserted $2 into the slot and waited for the mechanism to whir. Behind her, voices clustered near the coffee station. Dr. Caldwell. 3 other physicians. She didn't turn around, just watched her bottle descend in the machine. I'm just saying, Caldwell's voice projected across the space with the casual volume of a man who wasn't trying to be quiet, visible trauma like that raises questions about psychological fitness. He was talking about her. The 3 doctors with him made no move to correct or contradict him. Patient care requires a certain composure. When someone looks like they've been through a war, he paused, and Margaret knew exactly when his eyes found her back, you have to wonder if they're still fighting it in their heads. One of the younger physicians noticed her. His eyes narrowed. He looked toward Caldwell, trying to signal something, a boundary, a warning. Caldwell met his gaze and continued, louder now, deliberate. I've documented my concerns with HR. For patient safety, you understand. Margaret's hand emerged from the machine with her water bottle. The plastic was cool against her palm. She twisted the cap, a deliberate motion, unhurried, the kind of slow composure that comes from having already survived worse. She turned, and for exactly 1 second, her eyes met Caldwell's. The room's fluorescent lights buzzed above them like angry insects. Her jaw was set in a way that might have looked calm to a stranger. The white knuckles on the bottle told a different story. She walked past him without a word, and the silence that followed was so thick you could have operated in it. That afternoon at the nurse's station, Caldwell approached her directly. Margaret was typing notes, actual notes this time, though the screen recorded the seconds her hands had stopped moving that morning. The elevator chimed. The hallway beyond the glass walls echoed with the organized chaos of a hospital running at capacity. Somewhere, a monitor beeped its 3-note pattern. "I need you to understand this isn't personal, Walsh." Caldwell's voice had shifted to something almost gentle, which made it worse. But when a surgeon steps back during a procedure, which we both know happened last month with that MVA case, and a nurse steps forward, it creates liability issues. Hierarchy exists for a reason. Margaret continued typing. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision. "Understood, doctor." Her voice could have been made of ice. Not angry ice. The kind of ice that forms at the bottom of very deep water, where nothing moved and nothing could touch it. "I've recommended a fitness for duty evaluation." Caldwell leaned closer, and Margaret could smell his cologne, expensive, aggressive, like something designed to announce itself. Those scars suggest trauma history. Significant trauma. And we can't have that compromising patient care. Margaret's typing never paused. The same sentence continued across the screen, her fingers moving through it like muscle memory executing a familiar pattern. She finished the line, punctuated it, and only then did her hand still. When she spoke, her voice was level in the way that voices become level after they've survived things that would make other people break. "I understand, doctor." That was all. No defense. No explanation. No crack in the mask. Caldwell nodded, satisfied with the compliance he was hearing, and walked away. Behind him, Margaret's eyes moved to her screen. She had typed the word stable 17 times in succession, each repetition identical, each one pressed into the digital record with the kind of focus that was less about documentation and more about anchoring herself to something true. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. The trauma alert overhead cut through the afternoon like a blade. Gunshot wound, thoracic, male, mid-40s, special forces, ETA 4 minutes. The words dispatched themselves through the hospital's nervous system, and Margaret's body responded before her brain finished processing, a response so automatic it might have looked instinctive to someone watching. Muscle memory. 7 years of routine couldn't bury what came before it. She moved toward the trauma bay out of habit, already calculating what would be needed, which medications, which equipment. The muscle patterns were still there, underneath. She made it 6 feet. Caldwell intercepted her at the corner. "Recovery wing, Walsh. We discussed this." She redirected without argument. No negotiation. No pushback. She turned and walked toward recovery, and if Caldwell had been watching her hands instead of her face, he might have noticed that they were forming shapes, making small adjustments in the air, phantom movements, the kind that happen when a body knows what to do and an assignment says to do something else. The trauma bay was chaos of the efficient kind. Dr. Rahman was already there, capable but young, his surgical experience measured in dozens of cases where nothing had gone wrong because nothing unusual had happened. The major arrived on a stretcher with 2 paramedics calling out vitals in that compressed language designed to communicate catastrophe quickly. GSW thoracic. Entry wound mid-chest, left side. Exit wound back, massive. Pressure dropping fast. Margaret watched from the hallway through the observation window. She had been assigned to restock a crash cart that didn't need restocking, busy work, the kind that kept her present and visible but prevented her from being useful. Her hands moved through the motions, shifting supplies that didn't need shifting. Her eyes didn't leave the trauma bay. Rahman called for chest tube placement. The major's pressure dropped another 5 points. Rahman's hands moved toward the insertion site, and Margaret saw the hesitation the way a predator sees movement in tall grass, immediately, completely. The anatomy was complicated by previous surgical scarring. The Major's body had stories written in scar tissue, evidence of previous violence survived. Rahman was smart enough to see the complication. Not smart enough to know what to do with it. 15 seconds of hesitation. 20. The anesthesiologist's voice rose, climbing toward panic. "Doctor, we need to move." Through the window, Margaret's hands stopped moving. She set down the faux kit she'd been sorting. Her eyes tracked every detail of the scene, Rahman's angle of approach, the depth of his palpation, the location he'd chosen for the insertion. All of it slightly wrong. The kind of wrong that didn't trigger alarms immediately but would compromise effectiveness, slow the recovery, risk fluid accumulation and the complications that followed. Her jaw set. Not imperceptibly this time. The movement was small but visible to anyone paying attention, the clenching of teeth, the slight bulge in her masseter muscle, the signal that something had shifted. She pushed through the trauma bay doors. Her voice, when it came, was level and professional, the kind of voice that belonged in this space. "You're not assigned," a resident started. Margaret didn't respond. She moved to the opposite side of the table, her hands already gloved from the crash cart work, and addressed Rahman directly. "Permission to assist, Dr. Rahman." Rahman's eyes widened. His face was sheened with sweat. His pressure gauge was screaming. The Major's pressure was now 78/40 and dropping. He nodded, not because he wanted to but because he was drowning, and the woman across from him moved like someone who knew how to reach a life preserver underwater. Margaret's hands moved with muscle memory, technique that had been taught at Fort Bragg by instructors who were no longer alive, refined over 214 combat medical interventions across 3 tours in a place where you learned by necessity or you learned nothing. 2 intercostal spaces higher. 30-degree angle. Feel for the rib margin first. Her voice was instruction, not suggestion. There was no hesitation in it. The tube slid in. Pressure stabilized. The anesthesiologist stared at Margaret with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something they couldn't categorize. "I've only seen combat medics work like that. That's a bagram technique." Margaret's face showed nothing. She stripped her gloves with one smooth motion, disposed of them in the sharps container, and walked out of the trauma bay. The Major's pressure was climbing now. His body was responding to competence like a plant responds to water. But Dr. Caldwell had been in the observation gallery. He had watched everything. The hesitation. The intercession. The hands that moved like they had spent years in a place where mistakes meant body bags. He watched Margaret leave the trauma bay, and something in his expression shifted from satisfied contempt to something far more dangerous. Calculation. He pulled out his phone while the trauma team was still working, while the Major's body was still responding to the intervention that a 7-year hospital nurse shouldn't have been able to provide. He made the first call before the chest tube even drained its first unit of blood. The trauma bay doors were still swinging when Dr. Caldwell moved to intercept her. Margaret had been walking toward the controlled chaos, the Major's vitals on the monitor, the surgical team mobilizing, when Caldwell's hand caught her elbow with the gentleness of a man performing for an audience that wasn't there. "Recovery wing," he said quietly. Not a suggestion. Not a question. "Effective immediately, Margaret. I need post-op coverage. We're at capacity." Margaret didn't pull away. She didn't even pause. She simply pivoted, her scrubs rustling like paper in wind, and walked toward the recovery wing without acknowledgement. Caldwell watched her go, his jaw tight, his eyes calculating. He'd seen what happened in that trauma bay for the 43 seconds before the chief of surgery took over. He'd seen her hands move with a precision that didn't match 7 years of routine hospital nursing. He'd seen the anesthesiologist's face change. He'd seen too much. By 1400 hours that same afternoon, a memo arrived on Margaret's workstation. Official letterhead. Seattle General Department of Surgical Services. Her assignment was being modified. permanent reallocation to post-operative recovery and acute care monitoring. The memo bore Caldwell's signature in black ink, bold, confident, weaponized bureaucracy. No explanation. No timeline for reconsideration. Just the stamp of institutional authority, pressed down like a boot. Margaret read it once. Then she logged back into the patient management system and began her new rotation. The post-op recovery wing was a different universe from the trauma bays. Quieter. Slower. Patients waking from anesthesia, their surgeries complete, their crises already resolved by people whose names would be remembered. Margaret moved between beds with the same precise efficiency she'd brought to everything else, vitals every 15 minutes, dressing changes with gloved hands that knew exactly how much pressure to apply, for monitoring that caught infiltration before it became a problem. She worked in isolation, as Caldwell had intended. No overlap with the trauma teams. No chance to be seen doing anything extraordinary. Just a nurse in a recovery wing, doing what any competent nurse would do. But that wasn't the worst part. The Major's vitals remained stable for the first 18 hours. 36 hours into his admission, the trauma team reported his condition as improving. The anesthesiologist, the one who'd whispered those 5 words during the 4-point compression technique that had saved the Major's life, had gone home believing the crisis had passed. Believing that the complex manual compression Margaret had performed, where she'd splayed her scarred fingers across the Major's sternum and applied pressure in 4 quadrants simultaneously to maximize cardiac output without damage to ribs, was something he'd never see again outside of combat medicine training films. Margaret changed the Major's post-operative dressings on day 2, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. Not in hospitals. Not in recovery wings. In field tents and forward operating bases where the difference between a properly dressed wound and a carelessly bandaged one was the difference between infection and survival. She was meticulous. She was invisible. That night, Emma asked why Mommy was so quiet at dinner. Just tired, baby, Margaret said, and it was true in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She pulled her daughter close while they watched a cartoon, Emma's small weight against her chest, and later, when Emma was asleep, Margaret opened her locker and took out the tarnished challenge coin she kept in a small zippered pouch in her bag. The coin was old. Older than Emma. The metal was worn smooth in places, rough in others where it had been damaged, shrapnel scarring from an explosion that had happened 8,000 miles away and 13 years ago. She turned it over in her scarred hands, her thumb tracing the inscription on the back, names and coordinates. Call signs and grid references. The things you carried when you couldn't carry people anymore. When you were the only one who came home. She pressed the coin into her palm, feeling its weight, feeling the edges bite slightly into her skin. Then she put it back in the pouch and closed the locker door. Day 3. 0300 hours. The alarms came in sequence, first the monitor, then the overhead page. Code blue, Recovery Bay 7. Margaret was already moving before her conscious mind caught up with her training. The post-op recovery physician was in the building, a resident named Torres who was competent but not experienced with thoracic trauma complications. The code team was minutes out. What Margaret saw on the monitor as she moved into the bay told her everything: muffled heart sounds on assessment, distended neck veins, the distinctive pressure changes that meant blood was filling the space around the heart itself. Pericardial tamponade. The pericardium, the fibrous sac that surrounded and protected the heart, had filled with blood from the surgical site. The heart was being compressed. It was literally being suffocated by its own protective membrane. Torres was freezing. The post-op nursing staff, competent at routine monitoring and standard protocols, had no framework for this. One of them, a nurse named Chen, was performing compressions on the Major's chest while her eyes tracked the monitor showing flat line. "Stop compressions," Margaret said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't a request. "Torres, we have tamponade. The code team is 90 seconds out minimum. We should." Torres was staring at the monitor like the answer was written in the waves. It wasn't. The answer was in the physics of cardiac perfusion and the biology of a heart that couldn't beat if something was crushing it. Margaret moved to the crash cart and opened the surgical kit. Scalpel. Forceps. Retractors. Her hands had done this before. Not in a hospital. Not under fluorescent lights. In a field tent on the edge of Kabul where the anesthesia was a cigarette and a prayer, and the only thing between a Marine and death was a field medic with 2 deployed hands and a Master Chief's authority. You can't, Chen started. Scalpel. Now. The word carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Chen handed it to her without another word. Margaret incised. 3 precise cuts following the thoracic anatomy she'd memorized in a classroom that no longer existed, in a training that had supposedly been erased from official records. She spread the incision, exposed the pericardium, and incised the sac with the kind of careful precision that came from having done this with nothing but a field knife and the absolute certainty that the alternative was burying another body in Arlington. The moment the pericardium opened, blood spilled, too much blood, urgent blood, blood that had been catastrophically compressing the Major's heart. She reached in. Her scarred hands, the same hands that had been ridiculed in the vending machine, that had been deemed outdated and unfit by a man who'd never saved a life with his own fingers, found the heart. The organ was small under her palm, smaller than the textbooks suggested when you were actually holding it. She felt the collapsed chambers. She performed direct cardiac massage, her 4 points of contact distributing pressure across the ventricles with the mechanical precision of someone who understood that this was now a hydraulic problem with a biochemical solution. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her voice was steady as a metronome. The room had gone dead silent except for the monitor, which was picking up electrical activity again. Weak. Irregular. But present. Rhythm returning, someone whispered. The trauma team arrived 90 seconds later, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd worked together 100 times. They took over the compressions, actual surgical staff, board-certified trauma surgeons who could write in charts with authority. They stared at the open chest. They stared at Margaret's blood-covered hands. They stared at the tattoo that had become visible now, the sleeve of her scrub having ridden up during compressions, revealing not just burned scars but ink worked intentionally through them. A trident with a combat medic star. Names and coordinates. Call signs and grid references. Dr. Caldwell arrived 2 minutes after that. He said nothing. He simply observed the open chest, the interventions, the evidence of hands that had knowledge they shouldn't possess. His eyes moved from the Major's exposed heart to Margaret's forearms, lingering on the tattoo, lingering on the scarred tissue, lingering on the understanding that he'd been working in the same hospital with someone whose professional competence suggested a background that contradicted her official file. He turned and walked out of the recovery bay without a word. Margaret continued assisting with the closure, her voice giving instructions, her hands knowing exactly where to place instruments, her presence commanding the room in a way that made even the attending surgeons listen. By 1600 hours, Dr. Caldwell was in his office making phone calls. The first was to the hospital board president, James Mackenzie, a venture capitalist who donated the obstetrics wing and believed he understood hospital administration because he understood quarterly earnings. Caldwell's voice was steady, concerned, professional. We have a compliance issue. A staff member whose background doesn't align with her credentials. I want to protect the institution. I think we need an investigation. The second was to the State Nursing Licensing Bureau in Atlanta. A different tone this time, official, clinical, the voice of a physician concerned about patient safety. I've observed some unusual competency gaps that suggest this nurse may have experienced psychological trauma. Her charting is inconsistent. Her responses to stress are unpredictable. I believe we should have her evaluated before she harms someone. The third was to a man named Eric Voss, who answered his phone on the second ring. Caldwell kept Voss on retainer specifically for situations like this, situations where an institutional problem required the kind of solution that couldn't be solved through official channels. I need a comprehensive background check. Deep dive. Everything. And I need it yesterday. There's a nurse here, Margaret Walsh, 7 years with us, and something about her doesn't add up. Voss was already typing. He was good at this kind of work. Caldwell had hired him twice before, once for a resident with a drug problem that needed to disappear quietly, once for a board member whose relationship with a pharmaceutical rep had been compromising the hospital's clinical decisions. Voss had the kind of resources that didn't officially exist. Access to databases that weren't supposed to be accessible. Contacts in places Caldwell didn't ask about. "Give me a week," Voss said. "Give me 3 days," Caldwell replied. "And keep this quiet." He hung up and stood at his window, looking out at Savannah's humid afternoon, at the Spanish moss hanging from the oaks like something waiting to be cut down. Margaret Walsh was a problem, but she was a problem he could solve. Institutional power was his weapon, and he wielded it with the competence of a man who'd never lost. He made notes in his private file, the one he kept on staff members who'd disappointed him, who demonstrated independence or competence that threatened the careful hierarchy he'd constructed. By the time the sun set on that Tuesday in Savannah, Margaret was home with Emma, making pasta and listening to her daughter's detailed explanation of a friendship drama that seemed to require the intensity of international relations to resolve. Margaret nodded in all the right places. She asked questions at appropriate intervals. But her mind was somewhere else. Her hands, which had been inside a man's chest that afternoon, were now stirring sauce, and she was thinking about a phone call she hadn't heard but knew was coming. She was thinking about the tattoo that had been visible, that had caught a doctor's eye, that had triggered the kind of institutional machinery that didn't forgive people for being more than they appeared to be. She pulled her challenge coin from her bag and held it once more, just briefly, just long enough to remember that she'd already died once. The real death had come at Bagram, in a grid reference she could still locate on a map if she needed to. This thing happening now, the investigation, the suspicion, the institutional unraveling, was just an echo. Just a person learning what she'd already known. That heroism in the dark comes with a cost that keeps collecting interest long after the mission is complete. The cardiac monitor beeped once. Twice. Then flatlined. The code team froze. A resident stared at the screen like the numbers would rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. The attending surgeon took a step back. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid around the heart, pressure building, the organ drowning in its own pericardium. The major's blood pressure had cratered to 40 over nothing. There was no time for imaging. There was no time for anything except the one thing nobody in this room was trained to do. Margaret moved before her brain finished processing. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory older than her civilian identity, older than her nursing license, older than the woman named Margaret Walsh. She grabbed a scalpel from the crash cart. The fluorescent lights hummed above her like a swarm of angry wasps. Someone tried to stop her. "You can't." "Shut up." It wasn't a request. It was a command. She cracked his chest open with the kind of precision that only comes from having done it 17 times before under fire, her scarred hand steady as a surgical laser, and reached in. The pericardium glistened like a balloon filled with blood. She cut it open. 400 milliliters of dark fluid spilled into her palms. The pressure released. The heart gasped and shuddered and began to beat again, weak but real, a bird that had been crushed under a stone suddenly remembering how to fly. Margaret's voice came steady and cold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Direct cardiac massage. Her fingers on the major's ventricle, compressions that felt like she was holding his entire life in her hands because she was. The anesthesiologist watched her technique and whispered, "I've only seen combat medics work like that." The heart rate climbed. 60. 70. 80 beats per minute. Normal sinus rhythm. The major's blood pressure returned like a miracle that nobody would remember the way it should be remembered. She withdrew her hands. Someone handed her gauze. She didn't need it. The fluid was already gone. The wound could close. The major was alive because of the 4-point compression technique she'd performed in a dusty FOB in Loga province, because of the skills nobody here knew she possessed, because of the version of Margaret Walsh that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The room exhaled. Dr. Caldwell watched from the observation gallery, his face carved from stone. His fingers were moving, making a phone call list in his head. The investigator had already promised results. What Caldwell didn't know was that his very desire to destroy her had already set events in motion that would destroy him instead, but that's the thing about men who play with fire. They never believe they can burn. 6 a.m. the next morning, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. Chief of Staff's office. Attendance mandatory. Her stomach went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the medical crisis of the previous day. Something had shifted. Something had broken. She dressed in the scrubs she'd washed twice and arrived at Seattle General to find the hallways smelling like antiseptic and regret. Dr. Morrison looked uncomfortable in a way that suggested he'd been coached on how to deliver bad news. Dr. Caldwell sat across from him in a chair that cost more than Margaret made in a month. A hospital attorney occupied the third seat, her expression neutral, her briefcase containing the kind of documents that ended careers. A manila folder lay on the polished desk between them like a loaded gun. Nurse Walsh, please sit. Morrison gestured to the chair opposite them, the chair meant for the accused. Margaret Saturday. Her hands folded in her lap. Her face a mask of professional neutrality. We've received information that raises serious concerns about your credentials and background. Morrison opened the folder. Inside, a printout of her employment history. Gaps. 2 years here, missing. 3 years there, vanished. A social security number that didn't trace back before 2016. References that led to disconnected phone numbers. A nursing license valid on its face but with irregularities in the initial application that suggested the documentation had been rebuilt from nothing, which it had. Everything was technically accurate. Everything was technically a lie. Caldwell leaned forward. His voice carried the certainty of a man who had already won. We have a duty to our patients to ensure every staff member is exactly who they claim to be. These discrepancies suggest either fraud or identity issues that create significant liability for this institution. Margaret opened her mouth. I can explain. You won't. Morrison cut her off. Not unkindly, but finality hung in those 3 words. Until this investigation concludes, you're suspended without pay, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. The attorney slid a document across the desk. Termination paperwork. Suspension letter. A notice that Margaret Walsh, RN, was no longer permitted on hospital grounds. Caldwell added the final knife, and given that you performed a surgical procedure yesterday without proper credentialing or authorization, the state licensing board is considering criminal charges. Unlicensed practice of medicine. Margaret stood. Security appeared in the doorway before she even finished standing, 2 officers who looked embarrassed to be doing this job. She understood. They were just following orders. That's what everyone always said when they erased someone. She wasn't given time to change out of her scrubs. That was intentional, she knew. Walk her out in hospital clothes so everyone would know she was being removed. So the whispers would start before she even reached the parking lot. Staff members stared as she passed. A resident she'd trained turned away. A nurse Margaret had worked with for 4 years suddenly found something very interesting to read on a clipboard. The investigator's report was thorough because Caldwell had paid for thorough. It listed every gap in her timeline, every moment that didn't connect to the next moment, every inconsistency in the identity she'd built like a sandcastle against a tide that had been coming for years. What the report couldn't possibly know was that those gaps existed for a reason. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had died officially on June 3, 2016, when an IED killed her entire team. Her records had been scrubbed by Pentagon order. Her existence had been erased because the operation she'd run had been so classified that even the after-action reports were incinerated. She'd been ordered to disappear, and she'd built a new person from nothing, and now that person was being dismantled by a surgeon who couldn't stand the idea that a nurse had saved a patient's life better than he ever could. That night, Emma found her at the kitchen table. Margaret was still wearing her scrubs because she'd been escorted out too quickly to change. The suspension letter lay in front of her, official letterhead making it real, making it permanent, making it true. Margaret was crying, silent tears that ran down her face like rain on a window, and Emma, who was 9 years old and hadn't learned yet that the world could be unfair in this specific way, climbed into her lap. "Mommy, why are you sad? Why are you home?" Margaret couldn't speak. She tried. Her throat closed. She tried again. "Mommy made a mistake at work, baby." Emma leaned back and looked at her mother's face. "It's okay. Mistakes happen. You always tell me that." Margaret pulled her daughter close and cried harder because Emma didn't understand that sometimes you save someone's life and the world destroys you for it. You can't explain to a 9-year-old that you died once already, that you buried your team in a place where the heat makes the air shimmer like water, that you built a new life from the ashes of the old one, and now that new life was burning too. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table in the dark. The only light came from her phone. She opened her locker app, the one that held her personal items at Seattle General. A photo of Emma. A spare set of scrubs. And the tarnished military challenge coin she'd kept hidden in the deepest pocket, the one piece of physical evidence that Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had ever existed at all. She held it in her scarred palm. The metal was cool and real and the only truth she had left. She'd carried it for 8 years. Through morning shifts and night shifts and the moment when a Special Forces major walked into her trauma bay and she recognized the look in his eyes. Through every interaction with Dr. Caldwell, through every insult, through every moment of perfect composure while her inside screamed. The coin had stayed hidden. The coin had kept her secret. But coins don't stay secret forever. Someone always notices. Someone always remembers. The administrative hearing notice arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, printed on letterhead that felt heavier than paper should. Margaret's hands didn't shake as she read it. 2 p.m., Hospital Board Conference Room, attendance required or automatic termination. For days. That was how long they were giving her to prepare for the end of everything. She kept the notice folded in her locker next to the tarnished challenge coin, both of them sitting in the darkness like evidence of a life that no longer existed. The major walked through those conference room doors at exactly 1:58 p.m., pale but upright, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was still learning to trust itself again. 2 officers in dress greens followed him. Not escorts. Guardians. Their presence filled the room like a change in air pressure, and the hospital administrator, Chief of Staff Morrison, straightened in his chair with the instinctive respect of someone recognizing authority he couldn't argue with. "Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh," the major said quietly. His voice carried the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I'm here to tell you why." One of the officers stepped forward to hospital security, his movements economical. "We're here for Reaper," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. That's a classified designation. I suggest you step aside. The captain, his nameplate read Holloway, approached Margaret slowly. She didn't move. The room held its breath. His fingers reached for her forearm, the scarred one, and gently pushed back her sleeve. There, woven through the burned tissue like a second skeleton, was the tattoo, a trident with a combat medic star at its center, and beneath it, names. Coordinates. Dates. Bagram, 2008. Kandahar, 2010. Sanjin, 2011. Holloway's jaw tightened. "Master Chief," he whispered. The major stood at attention. Lifted his right arm in a salute so sharp it sounded like a gunshot in the silence. His arm trembled slightly. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was restraint. It was respect given to someone who had held his bleeding chest cavity in her scarred hands and refused to let him die. At ease, Margaret said quietly. The first command she'd spoken aloud in 7 years, and the room obeyed her? The colonel, his uniform bore the insignia of JSOC Command, opened a tablet and began reading in a voice like gravel. Silver Star, June 2010, for extracting wounded personnel under sustained enemy fire. Second Silver Star, August 2011, for actions on a classified operation that remain classified. Purple Heart, awarded in absentia, for wounds sustained when an IED detonated 20 meters from her position, killing 3 team members and 1 local child she was treating. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, served 3 tours of duty, 147 confirmed operational saves, 2 of which involved combat applications of battlefield medicine that set new standards for post-traumatic intervention. He paused. Your official record was sealed by direct order of the Pentagon. Your name was removed from every roster, every manifest, every official database. You were ordered to disappear. You did. Morrison's attorney opened a second folder with a sound like a blade being drawn. Dr. Caldwell's investigator, the colonel continued, filed a comprehensive background report. That report was thorough enough to trigger automatic protocols at JSOC. We knew someone was probing classified personnel. We found out who. And we found out what he was really hiding. The captain opened a third folder. Hospital records. Patient files with handwritten annotations. Dates and surgeon initials that didn't match the surgical logs. Margaret watched Morrison's face go grey as he read. Falsified outcomes. Ghost surgeries. A trauma surgery on September 14 that never happened, billed to Medicare for $47,000. Another on September 21, 11 phantom procedures across 6 years. Medicaid fraud at a scale that triggered federal liability. And beneath it all, the systematic burial of complaints, nurses reassigned, resident testimonies lost, and one particular incident, 3 years prior, where a junior nurse named Chen had questioned Caldwell's technique on a post-operative patient and found herself transferred to the night shift in pediatrics, her complaint file deleted from HR. His investigator, the colonel said, accessed hospital servers to compile this background check. He included those access logs in his final report. He didn't understand what he'd found. He reported everything. We knew what to look for. The hospital attorney turned to the empty chair where Caldwell should have been sitting. He'd left 20 minutes before the hearing started, a decision that would cost him everything. Get him back in here, Morrison said, but even as he spoke, security was radioing the parking lot. Caldwell's car was already exiting onto Victory Drive, and he wasn't coming back. The next 30 days unfolded like dominoes falling in slow motion. The State Medical Board launched a formal investigation based on the evidence now public. 3 former patients came forward with their own stories, outcomes that didn't match the documented procedures, complications that appeared in their personal medical journals but vanished from hospital records. The federal Medicare fraud investigation expanded. News broke about the phantom surgeries. Caldwell's board connections evaporated. His attorney negotiated a plea deal, no jail time in exchange for full restitution and permanent license revocation. His medical license became something he could no longer claim, and his name became something people whispered with the particular tone reserved for those who'd violated sacred trust. By week 3, Margaret's suspension was officially lifted. Back pay. Formal apology. A private meeting with Morrison in his office where he said the words no administrator wanted to say, "The hospital failed you. We should have been paying attention." She returned to the ICU on a Tuesday morning, 7.5 weeks after being escorted out in her scrubs. Her challenge coin, now polished until it gleamed like new chrome, hung on a lanyard next to her Seattle General badge. The tarnish was gone, buffed away with soft cloth and intention. Her sleeve was rolled up to her elbow, the tattoo visible for the first time since her discharge 7 years ago. Colleagues who'd avoided her eyes for a decade now stopped mid-conversation when they saw her. The whispers changed. Not mockery. Recognition. A resident named Chen, different time, but the name meant something, asked if Margaret would demonstrate the 4-point compression technique in a training session. Margaret agreed without hesitation. She showed the room how pressure distribution could maintain perfusion when everything else had failed. How hand-steady from 1,000 hours of practice could speak a language that had nothing to do with words. The Major returned to the ICU 3 days before his discharge, fully ambulatory, the surgical scar on his chest pale but clean. He found Margaret restocking a medication cart and waited until she turned. "Thank you, Master Chief," he said. Then he turned to the entire ICU staff and added quietly, "Thank you for saving my life." That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with Emma, her 9-year-old daughter, and opened a memory box. Inside was the old photo of her team from Bagram. Names she still said every morning. Hassan, who had a sister in Kabul. Rodriguez, who wanted to be an engineer. Williams, who'd written letters to his daughter and asked Margaret to mail them if something happened. Williams had been 23. These people, Margaret told Emma, pointing to the photo, they were my family. They don't get to go to the farmer's market or watch cartoons or grow up. So I made a choice to remember them every single day. The tattoo on my arm, those are their names. That's why I have it. Emma studied the photo with the seriousness of a child trying to understand something that mattered. So they're always with you? Always, Margaret confirmed. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning that smelled like wet earth and spring flowers, Margaret and Emma walked through the farmer's market in downtown Savannah. The sun was warm enough to warrant short sleeves, and Margaret wore them without hesitation now. Her burn scars visible. Her tattoo visible. Her polished challenge coin swinging on its lanyard next to her Seattle General ICE badge. She wore the badge even on her days off, a small defiance and a small declaration. Emma pulled her toward the strawberry stand. Margaret followed, and as they moved through the vendor rows, her eyes caught a folding table under a cheap pop-up canopy. CALDWELL Insurance was printed on vinyl, letters already starting to fade. A man in a polo shirt that didn't fit right was explaining deductibles to an elderly couple who looked deeply skeptical about the entire interaction. Dr. Caldwell. No longer Dr. Anything. Margaret stopped at the peach vendor directly next to his table. Emma selected 3 peaches with the seriousness of a sommelier choosing wine. Margaret paid cash, $32 for premium fruit, and accepted the brown paper bag with both hands. Her challenge coin caught the sunlight as she shifted the bag, casting a brief golden reflection across Caldwell's face. He glanced up. Recognition flickered across his features like a light switch turning on. Then it died. The face of a man who'd learned that invisible people weren't actually invisible, they'd just been letting you see what you expected to see. Margaret turned and walked away without a single glance in his direction. Emma chatted about weekend plans, completely unaware that anything had happened. 2 stalls down, Emma looked up. "Mommy, was that man staring at you?" Margaret paused, considering the question with the same seriousness Emma had given the peaches. "Some people do, baby. The scars and the tattoo make them curious." Emma thought about this with the profound wisdom of childhood. "I think they're cool. They mean you helped people." Margaret stopped walking. Kneeled down. Pulled her daughter close enough to feel her heartbeat, her breathing, her absolute certainty of being loved. "Yeah, baby. That's exactly what they mean." When she stood again, she took Emma's hand and walked deeper into the market, past the spring flowers and vendor calls, past the tables laden with the ordinary miracles of things that grew from the ground and lived without asking for permission to exist. Her head was high. Her scars visible. Her past no longer something that had to hide in darkness. The polished challenge coin swung on her lanyard, catching light and throwing it back at the world. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. And Margaret had learned a long time ago that the world wasn't actually watching anymore, or perhaps it had never been watching at all, because real heroism happens in the moments no one sees, the bleeding you stop, the lives you hold together with nothing but steady hands and absolute refusal to let go. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, you know exactly how Margaret Walsh felt. Subscribe for more stories about the people whose quiet strength changes everything, and comment below, what would you have done in her position?